Hematite is one of the most important minerals to use for decorating ancient pottery replicas in the Southwest. Nearly every decorated pottery type used hematite, and definitely every culture used hematite for decorating pottery. So today I'm going to talk about locating, processing, and using hematite for decorating pottery. Hematite is merely the natural form of what ceramic stores call red iron oxide. It's just oxidized iron. You can even make iron oxide paint out of rust if you want to. If we think about the different cultures that used iron oxide here in southern Arizona, Hohokam red on buff uses hematite for the paint. Mimbres black on white uses hematite for the paint. Salado polychrome uses hematite for that hematite wash. The red areas on Salado polychrome are made from hematite. Ramos polychrome uses hematite for the paint. The red paint on this pottery is made from hematite. So we see that this was used all over the Southwest. And in fact, if we looked at primitive pottery around the world, we would find a lot of hematite being used. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, hematite's really easy to work with. If you can find soft hematite, then it's pretty easy to grind into a powder usable for paint. And secondly, hematite is one of the most common minerals in the world. You can go almost anywhere in the world and find hematite rocks. So how do you go about finding it? One of the best ways I've found to locate where hematite is to go to a website called mindat.org. That's mindat.org. And on that website, they have cataloged all the information on hundreds and thousands of old mines all over the world. And so if you scroll to the bottom of the homepage, there's an area search. So you can type in the mineral you're looking for and the location you're looking in. So in this case, I can type in hematite and then Arizona for the location, and I can find all the hematite sources in Arizona, at least all those that are associated with old mines that have been cataloged in this website. But it is a lot. No doubt there are many other hematite sources that aren't even in here. And you can be a lot more specific than just Arizona. I could say Cochise County, for example, to narrow that search down to a smaller area. You could try the same thing where you live. Now, let's say you've already found a spot where there's hematite. Let's talk about how you know what hematite to use. Hematite comes in all sorts of forms. It comes in different colors. Some of it is black, and some of it is very bright red, and everything in between, including shades of maroon and purple. Some of it is very hard. The hard stuff is not really usable for paint. You want the soft, the kind of chalky hematite that's easy to grind up into a powder. And it's easy to find out in the field just how soft and usable it is. Now you can see there's a lot of hematite in here, but it's all sorts of different grades, and some of it's mixed with other minerals, so you need to be careful. Best thing to do is to find a rock that is hard, that is not hematite. In this case, maybe some sort of granite. And then when you find a rock that you think might be usable, you can scratch it on the rock. And the results, as you can see, there's that red powder I'm looking for. Now this is very brown. It's not the brightest. What you're going to find is that hematite varies quite a bit from piece to piece in the shade of red and the softness. So what I'm looking for, or optimally what I would like to find, is a very bright red that is relatively soft. But it depends a lot on the kind of pottery you're trying to make. For example, if you're trying to make Hohokam red on buff, the red paint on Hohokam pottery tends to be very dark red, almost purpley. And so you might be looking for that dark red in that case. If you're making Salado polychrome, on the other hand, you might be looking for a very bright, almost orangey colored red. And that's another thing. Now, these can also change color in the firing. So once you find them and take them home and process them, you still want to run some tests before you put too much work into it and are disappointed with the results. So I've collected a few good rocks of hematite. And you might think that's not very much, but when it comes to pigment minerals, it doesn't take very much. A few rocks like this might last me for months or years because you're not using nearly as much. If I was collecting clay out here, I'd want a 5-gallon bucket or something, but this is enough to do a lot of pots. You can always tell good hematite because it gets down in the pores of your hands, makes them all red. Look at the handle of my rock hammer. See that? That's a blue handle. But it's just coated in that really fine hematite. Almost gives it a metallic sheen. And that tells you that's really fine particle hematite. The kind of stuff that's going to get down in the pores of your pottery. It's going to work really well. All right, so I've collected my hematite stone. Now what? How do I turn these rocks into pottery paint? Well, there's two ways to do it. Well, no, go back. In reality, there's probably a million ways to do it. But there are two primary ways to do it that I'm aware of that work good. The first way, the easiest way to do it, is just to take these hematite rocks. Now remember, in the field, I've already determined that they're relatively soft. That's an important criteria for this. I'm going to take this hematite rock, and I'm going to take a flat stone. It helps if you have a flat stone with a small depression in it like this, but if you don't, you can use anything that's flat and solid like that. It has to have kind of a coarse texture. So you could even use like a brick. And you just take the hematite and you just scrub it on that stone. And you just make paint out of it. It creates a powder as you scrub it. You can add a little water to it if you're just trying to use it as straight hematite. Usually if you're using it as a pottery paint, you need to add some clay to it. Otherwise, that paint is going to be fugitive. That means after the firing, it's going to brush off. It's just going to come off of the pot. There's nothing in it that'll make it harden in the firing or stick to the pottery. And that's why I add usually about a third to a half clay to that. So that's the easiest way. This is the way a lot of Native Americans use it. I've seen Hopi potters make paint this way, and I've seen Acoma potters do the same thing, and I'm sure other Pueblos do as well. So this is the way a lot of the natives do it. I think the biggest problem with this is if you are adding other ingredients. For example, if you're adding clay to your hematite powder here, and you're wanting to add, let's say, a third clay, it's really hard to get those ratios right. So I might scrub some on here, but how much do I have? And how much clay do I need to add to this to make a third? It's hard to know. You're just eyeballing it. And then, as you're painting out of it, say this is used as a palette, so you add the water right to it and you paint right out of it. As you paint out of it, you use it up. Now, I take my stone and I scrub and I make some more paint. How much clay do I add now? Okay, so it's really kind of, you know, a lot of eyeballing and guessing, and your recipe can vary from place to place around the pot. You might actually have different colors as you work around the pot because different hematite stones, as we've talked about, have different shades of red. Or this same stone may have different shades of red within it. There may be a darker shade here, there may be a lighter shade here. And so as I'm scrubbing it, I may get into a lighter shade or a darker shade. And so as I'm working, the color of my paint can change as well. And so this is a good and an easy way to work. But if you want consistency, if you want a consistent recipe, you know, 2/3 pigment to 1/3 clay. If you want consistent color, then the best way is to pre-prepare your hematite and then measure it out. So I'm going to show you how to do that. This is some hematite powder that I processed some years ago. And you can see it's getting kind of low. So really, the impetus for making this video was I need more hematite powder for my little container here. This is what I use for most of my red paint. I'll take a little scoop, I have a little tiny scoop, and I'll scoop out 1 scoop of the red, and then whatever the recipe is. Sometimes it's like 2 scoops of red to 1 scoop of red clay, or 1 scoop of red to, you know, I might add manganese or copper or whatever, depending on what I'm trying to do with it. So it's real easy to get the recipe right when you're mixing it up ahead of time using a measurement. So this is why it's advantageous to process your hematite ahead of time, have it all powdered up. And so I'm going to show you now how to get it from the rock into the powder. So I've got these weird hematite rocks I collected some years back in Cortland, Arizona. And they have a lot of good red hematite in them, but they also have some kind of a weird, like a matrix around them, kind of a honeycomb. You can see it here, these little pores. So the way I usually process this is I use a hammer to break it into small pieces, then I run it through my corn grinder, grind it into as fine a powder as possible, and then I levigate the really fine hematite out of it. Okay, I got it all ground up. It's still not paint though. It's really coarse. This isn't the kind of stuff you'd want to paint on a pot. So I'm now going to separate the coarse material from the fine material, making the powder I use for paint. And I'm going to use a process called levigation. And that's just a fancy word for letting gravity separate those particles. That's the same thing that happens in nature. When dirt and soil is carried downstream by moving water, the moving water naturally sorts the gravel, the sand, the silt, and the clay into separate areas, which is why you get pure beds of clay in like lake bottoms, seabeds, river floodplains, places like that. So we're going to use that same principle using water and gravity to separate these particles of pigment. The process of levitation works like this. Stir up the material so those small particles get suspended in the water. Give it a minute to set so those larger particles can settle towards the bottom, and then pour off the fine material. Be careful you don't pour too deep. Then you'll start getting those larger particles, those silt-sized particles. Add some more water, stir it up again, give it a minute for that to set, for those larger particles to settle, and then pour. And you have to keep doing this. Add more water, stir it up, give it a minute to set, and then pour it off. And you'll do this until that receiving bucket is full, and then you have to let it set and settle so that you can pour off the clear water. Now I'm going to walk away for an hour or so and let that stuff settle in there. Now, it looks like it's still red, but as I start to pour, you will see that it's somewhat clear. So a lot of the particles have settled. There's still some in it, but the heavier stuff is at the bottom. And that's the stuff I'm going to let dry out and make my pigment out of. Good morning. Okay, I have a couple of problems today. First of all, the material that I levigated yesterday is here, and as you can see, it's still quite liquid after sitting in the sun all afternoon. Now, it's okay, I can leave it sit outside for a couple of days. I mean, I live in Arizona, it doesn't rain often, it's hot every day, and this will evaporate. So if you live in a humid climate, let's say you live in Louisiana, this would probably take forever to evaporate. So there's some things you can do to dry it out more quickly. For one thing, I could put this on the stove and just cook the water out of it. I have no danger of burning it because it's mineral, it won't burn. So that's one way to do it. I have put clay in the microwave to dry it out. I'm not sure if I want to put iron oxide in the microwave, given that it's metal. It might not do well in the microwave, I just don't know. So I think maybe today I'll try cooking some of the moisture out of this, just to show you how it's done and to kind of speed it up for the sake of getting this video done. My other problem is this. A lot of this leftover, there's still a lot of material in it, a lot of red pigment to get out of there. And a lot of those very fine particles stayed suspended in the water for a long time. I thought after like an hour or so they would settle. I came out yesterday around the time the sun went down, and there was still a lot of material suspended in the water. Well, that's a problem. That makes it hard to levigate when there's particles that will not settle out. So today I'm going to continue to levigate this because I want to get the most pigment out of there I can. I don't want to throw away any of it, especially when I've collected it myself and I've carried it, across the desert, hauled it, out of the back country. I want to try to get the most material out of it as I can. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to dry this so I can show you the whole process. But just so you know, I'm also going to continue to levigate on this because I do want to get those extra pigment out of there. And then the last thing is, when I was out collecting, I also found this earthy hematite, this material that wasn't a stone. And so I wasn't really sure how it was going to come out. I found this at the end of my trip after I'd already put the camera away. And so I just recorded it on my phone, not being sure how it was going to come out. And then I brought it home and I levigated it. And it turned out really good, actually. These are still drying, but they almost have a clay-like consistency. Very, very fine and very, very red material. So I'm really happy with that. I haven't tried it on a pot yet. But if you can find the earthy stuff like this saves me a lot of work. I don't have to break it up with a hammer. I don't have to run it through the grinder. I still have to levigate it to get the grit out of it. But as you can see, it seems to have turned out really well so far. Okay, so now I'm going to try to get this material that I levigated yesterday dried up. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about paint recipes and what works for using red iron oxide as a paint. One hot afternoon in the Arizona sun was all it took to dry up that hematite after its trip on my stove. As you can see, we now have dry powdered hematite. The trouble is it's kind of caked together now. So what I want instead of this caked material is a powder so that I can easily scoop it out and use it to make paint. So I'm going to grind this up before I put it in a jar. I've also bought a jar to put it in, a little jar, so it's clear, I can see what it is. Before I do that though, let's talk a little bit about how to use this stuff. Now that you've got the hematite, you don't just paint that on the pot. You have to mix it up with some clay in order to make paint, in most cases. I've done a lot of experiments with different paint recipes and different ways of using iron oxide, and this is what I've found. One, you can do what's called a hematite wash. You can just mix up the powdered hematite with water and paint that right on your pot. If you do it while the pot is still leather hard. If you wait until it's dry, this isn't going to work. And then, once that's firmed up a little bit on the pot, you go over it with a polishing stone, and that presses those hematite particles into the still damp clay, making it permanent. The other way is to make it into a paint. So in order to make those hematite particles permanent after the firing, keep them from wiping off, you're going to need to add clay to the hematite. I found that if you have a good hematite, you can add up to 50% clay, and it's still going to be just as colorful as it would be otherwise. And so what I generally do is about 50% powdered hematite and 50% red clay for a really good paint. This can be either red in an oxidation atmosphere or black in a reduction atmosphere. Now you can add some organic binder to that. That just makes the paint a little stickier, gives it some viscosity, and so that sometimes helps with the painting, but it's not necessary. Okay, let me get this ground up now. Now this is that other material, that earthy hematite I collected. And I'm going to go ahead and grind some of this up as well. That way we can compare the colors. Now, here's the important thing. Don't forget to label the jars, because you might think you'll remember now, but in 6 months to a year, you'll have no idea where this material came from. Well, as you can see, we came out with two very different shades of red. This is much more orange browny than the Maori material. And this is Cortland hematite. This is my old Cortland hematite. These were collected at the same time from the same place, and the colors are vastly different. This just goes to show what I said early on in this video about how every hematite rock is going to have a different shade of red. So if you're looking for a particular shade, search out those shades and collect only the rocks that are the colors you're looking for. And then, by grinding them all together, you make sure that the pot all comes out the same shade, because you're all got them all blended together. So I could blend these, but I'm going to not, just because they're so different. The good news is a little bit of hematite goes a long way, and this is enough to last me for years. And so I hope this was useful for you. If you're interested in learning more about using natural pigments to decorate pottery, I have a whole online masterclass that tells everything you need to know about the different kinds of materials to use, about how to gather and process them, about how to apply them, the whole thing. And I will link that up down the doobly-doo and in the comments in case you're interested in taking that class. In the meantime, if you're interested in learning more here on YouTube, check out this video here about the 4 easiest natural pottery pigments you can use. Thanks for watching today. I'll catch you next time.